Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a new episode of our Letter to Vox's podcast.
Today we're doing a really intricate exploration into the tragic world of Emma Bovary.
Yes, a character whose life, this intense, unfulfilled longing has resonated through literature for well over a century. We have a really dense stack of material here that acts as a meticulous blueprint for a profound tragedy set squarely in the mundane French provinces.
Our mission today is almost surgical. We really need to dissect the key psychological and social dynamics at play here.
That clash between fantasy and reality.
Exactly. The brutal clash between this fervent romantic fantasy and the just suffocating domestic reality that imprisons Emma. We're going to be meticulously tracing her path from a naive schoolgirl, completely obsessed with these artificial ideals, right through to her financial and personal ruin.
This is all about understanding how a soul just completely self-destructs.
Right, when its inner life refuses to align with the outer world.
So prepare yourselves, because we are looking at the suffocating nature of provincial mediocrity, the destructive ambition that's fueled by social climbing, and, the utter failure of self-delusion when it comes up against the crushing weight of reality.
This isn't just a story. It's Gustave Flaubert's detailed, almost clinical critique of the 19th century soul, caught between what it was promised and what it actually got.
Before we jump straight into the narrative of Emma and Charles, we really have to ground ourselves, however briefly, in the author who performed this magnificent literary dissection.
We are, of course, talking about Gustave Flaubert, and it's just impossible to separate the story from the man. He was known for this relentless pursuit of stylistic perfection, the famous mot juste, and his profound sense of irony about human folly.
And he got into a lot of trouble for this book, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. We should remember that Flaubert was deeply entrenched in the intellectual currents of his time, but he became famous for his legal troubles right after publishing this very novel. He was accused of obscenity, of offending public morals.
And even though he was eventually acquitted, that whole episode really cemented his reputation as a chronicler of, unvarnished reality.
Precisely. And while he may have been forced into the public spotlight, his literary output suggests a very meticulous, almost reclusive approach to creation.
You can see that in his other works.
Definitely. We have references to his posthumously published letters, which are incredible. They reveal the immense labor and, frankly, the frustration he poured into his prose. He would agonize over a single sentence for days.
And then there's the unfinished novel, Bovary et Pécuchet.
Published in 1881, which similarly explores the absolute intellectual and social mediocrity of bourgeois life. It's about two copying clerks who try to master all knowledge and fail spectacularly. Flaubert clearly had this lifelong obsession with the failure of human endeavor and the triumph of the commonplace.
And the era itself is just as critical as the author. The tone of this whole narrative is so profoundly connected to its historical setting, which our sources place in the context of the Biedermeier period.
That term, Biedermeier, is crucial. It describes the cultural and artistic movement in Central Europe roughly between 1815 and 1848, so right after the defeat of Napoleon.
So it's a reaction to all that chaos.
It's the tired, pragmatic reaction, exactly. If the Romantic era was about grand heroes and political upheaval and transcendent feeling, Biedermeier was the retreat. A profound retreat into the private sphere.
It sounds quiet.
Overwhelmingly domestic. It was intensely focused on family life, simple domestic virtues, comfort. A general weariness of grand political upheaval. The source points out that the rising middle class, the bourgeoisie, demanded its own art and culture focused on private happiness.
So simple furniture contained emotions.
And grand aspirations were often viewed with a lot of suspicion. This historical context just sharpens Emma's tragedy immensely.
So if the world outside is saying, be content with your little domestic life, and you've been raised on literature that says your life must be a dramatic opera, you are just set up for guaranteed conflict.
Exactly. The quiet domestic backdrop, the unassuming furniture, the focus on practical comfort. It just amplifies her personal feverish desire for grandeur. It makes it sound discordant and destructive.
It creates a pressure cooker.
It really does. Emma's inner life is epic. It's full of storms and passion. Her external world, ruled by Charles Bovary and the provincial timetable, is just relentlessly, stiflingly dull. Flaubert used this setting not just as a backdrop, but as an active agent in her destruction.
Hmm.
To really understand the enclosure Emma finds herself in, we absolutely must start with Charles Bovary. He is the very foundation of that mediocrity.
Right. His origins establish him as a truly unremarkable man, shaped by the stinginess and odd dynamics of his family.
And he's not malicious, he's just completely inadequate.
Hmm.
Our sources say his parents' motivation when it came to his education was pure thrift.
They sound like deeply flawed characters themselves.
Oh, completely. Charles was sent to school late. His father was this grumpy, misanthropic, former military surgeon who had retreated to a farm on the border of Caux and Picardy. He'd lost interest in the world and basically declared education a waste of time. "The world belongs to the bold," was his line.
And his mother.
His mother had endured a profoundly loveless marriage, which had turned her once gay, communicative, and cordial nature into something morose, quarrelsome, and nervous, as the text says, like wine turning to vinegar. She was the one who insisted on the education, maybe as a form of social aspiration. She never achieved herself.
So Charles grew up like a lily in the field, unsupervised, robust, and profoundly innocent.
Yes, innocent in the most detrimental sense of the word. Innocent and just profoundly lacking any natural talent or drive. He's described as quiet, lacking eloquence, and succeeding in his studies only by sheer diligence.
That diligence was just masking a deeper incompetence, wasn't it?
It was. The sources confirm he actually failed his initial medical examination. A significant setback he had to hide from his father for 5 long years. He was just destined for a life of passable adequacy and nothing more.
And the famous schoolboy anecdote with the hat, it just perfectly captures
Okay.
this manufactured out-of-sync quality he has.
It's Flaubert at his absolute best, using a single object to define a life. When Charles first walks into the classroom, he stands out immediately, not for talent, but for his ridiculously exotic cap.
And he doesn't throw it on the ground like all the other boys.
He clings to it, and the cap itself is a satirical masterpiece. It's egg-shaped, held up by whalebone splints, layered with 3 circular ridges, velvet, rabbit fur, and then crowned by this sack-like pop with embroidery and a small golden tassel hanging from a thin thread.
It's less a hat and more a small, doomed architectural project.
It's the sartorial equivalent of Charles's life, meticulously crafted by his well-meaning but utterly tasteless mother, guaranteeing instant ridicule. It symbolizes his entire existence, completely out of sync with his environment, earnest, but fundamentally wrong.
And that passive submission continues right into his first major life decision, marriage.
His mother orchestrated his union with the 45-year-old widow, Heloise. The description is just unflinching. Ugly, thin as a hop pole, and pockmarked. But she promised 1,200 francs in rent.
It was a transaction, not a romance, and it led straight into the financial trap that foreshadows his entire life, this inability to see reality when it comes to money.
Absolutely. The widow lied, her meager inheritance was entirely mortgaged, and when Charles's father discovered the deceit, the reaction was explosive. He threw a chair against the wall, smashing it to pieces.
So that establishes Charles's pattern.
Completely. He is a passive subject of other people's schemes, easily deceived, always taking the path of least resistance, and constantly struggling against a financial reality he just doesn't understand. And this is the man Emma believes will lead her into an epic life. The tragedy is set long before they even meet.
Thankfully for Charles, though, disastrously for Emma, his first wife dies. This frees him up for a second chance, which brings us to the pivotal encounter at the Rouault farm, Berthaud.
Right, the initial encounter, treating Papa Rouault's broken leg, it was professional, but for Charles it was immediately transforming. Emma was such a striking contrast to the grim, demanding reality of his first marriage.
She was a vision of country elegance. We're told she was wearing a blue merino dress with 3 flounces, but the key detail for Charles was her hair.
What was it about the hair?
It was dark, parted in the middle, smoothly styled, but crucially, it was waved over her temples, which the country doctor had never seen in his life. That one small detail of fashion marked her as exotic and refined.
And she had this habit of biting her lower lip when conversation lagged, suggesting a restlessness even then.
Yeah, the courtship that followed just established Charles's devotion to routine. He would ride over, but right before arriving, he'd meticulously clean his muddy boots with grass, pull on his brown gloves.
And just savor the simple, profound pleasure of riding into the farmyard. He felt an indefinable longing, a nameless happiness. For the first time, he felt ambition stir in him. He even looked at himself in the mirror and decided he wasn't bad looking.
Which is the absolute peak of Charles's ambition, isn't it? Simple, internal contentment from a repetitive, pleasant routine. He loved watching her clogs clatter on the kitchen tiles.
But his will to act was, non-existent. It led to this incredibly awkward proposal. Days would pass where he intended to speak, but he'd just fail. Finally, as Rouault was walking him off the property, Charles stutters, "Honored Mr. Rouault, I would like to tell you something."
And the father saw it coming a mile away.
Completely. They stopped behind a hedge, and the father basically finished the sentence for him. Charles just became crimson, a silent confirmation.
And the setting Flaubert chose for the proposal is perfect. Emma is inside, oblivious, sewing a white cotton stocking, watching the dust motes dance in the sunbeams. It's utterly domestic, static, and framed by dust. A subtle foreshadowing of the stifling reality that awaits her.
Then comes the wedding itself, which was anything but quiet. It was this massive, chaotic celebration.
Right, it perfectly captured the boisterous, unfiltered nature of the provincial gentry. Lavish, lasting all day and night, with relatives arriving in everything from new landaus to antediluvian gigs.
And this is where we see the synthetic nature of the romance Emma craves, symbolized by that truly extraordinary wedding cake. We need to talk about that cake.
Well, we do. It's a critical piece of satire.
It was constructed like a fortress tower made of gingerbread, encircled by battlements of bonbons, almonds, raisins, and orange slices. On the second floor, there's a cute Cupid swinging on a chocolate swing, with 2 actual living rosebuds stuck in the globe-adorned hooks.
It even had sugar meadows and rocks and ponds. It was a masterpiece of over-the-top, edible vulgarity.
That Cupid on a chocolate swing is the ultimate symbol of the romantic ideal Emma is embracing. Completely artificial, sugary, grotesque, and ready to melt under any pressure.
It's everything her books promised, realized in cheap, perishable confectionery.
And the chaos surrounding it was immense. Guests snoring, singing, telling spicy stories, performing feats of strength like lifting wheelbarrows to shoulder height.
But even in this chaos, Charles, no witty head, as the text says, he failed to shine. His contentment was internal, simple, and therefore totally invisible to his ambitious new bride. The honeymoon glow wore off almost immediately upon their arrival in Toasties. This is where the marriage just implodes, driven entirely by these mismatched expectations. It leads us directly into the heart of Bovarism.
The physical environment of their modest Toasties home is the first sign of Emma's impending despair. It was located right on the country road, noisy, dusty, exposed.
Not the gilded cage she envisioned.
Not at all. Inside, the great room was wallpapered with poorly pasted canary green paper, topped by a garland of faded flowers. Charles's consultation room was tiny, about 6 feet wide. This was a cheap, poorly maintained birdcage.
And Charles, the cage keeper, was completely, hopelessly satisfied.
He was a man of simple physical needs and zero intellectual curiosity. His ideals, a quiet life, predictable meals, sleep, peace were all fulfilled. He savored his domestic routine, enjoying his happiness, just like one who, after a feast, still tastes the truffles he has already digested.
He was content with so little, and for her, that was his fatal flaw.
And for Emma, that contentedness was more than boring. It was an active rejection of her idealized self. This brings us to the core theme of Bovarism, this pathology of chronic dissatisfaction derived from romantic delusion.
Her expectations weren't built on reality. They were fabricated by her convent education. She consumed romantic novels, reading Chateaubriand, and looking at engravings of veiled ladies, young men in mantles, passionate scenarios.
She craved egoistical pleasure, passion, and storm-driven romance, throwing aside anything that didn't serve to refresh her heart.
She was expecting Myron, and she got beige wallpaper.
Exactly. Charles's satisfied dullness was an insult to her imagination. His regular affection became a habit like all others, like the dessert that must come because it is on the menu. It was predictable, reliable, and therefore utterly devoid of passion. Flaubert is showing us her tragedy isn't that she married a bad man, but that she married a mediocre man.
And mediocrity is the one thing her romantic soul could not survive.
Right. This simmering discontent just explodes during the pivotal visit to the Marquis d'Andervilliers' estate for the Vaubyessard ball. This is the moment her fantasy is given physical form.
She saw a world of grand seigneur elegance, a level of refinement that utterly dwarfed provincial toasts. Flaubert focuses on the sensory details. The polished wood floors, the light reflected in mirrors, the men with their white skin tone, the complexion of the grand seigneur, maintained by careful nutrition.
A sign of a life of leisure.
And their indifferent, tranquil gazes reflected the security of continually satisfied senses. It hinted at a brutal, vain masterfulness. This was power and elegance incarnate.
And Charles, of course, was instructed to sit still. Besides, that is much better for a doctor. He was completely sidelined while Emma danced the cotillion with the Vicomte.
She was initially reluctant to waltz, but the Vicomte persuaded her. The dance was a physical metaphor for her desires. They began slowly, accelerated, and everything, lights, walls, furniture, spun around her until she felt she was in the center of a dizzying top.
And she finally, dizzy and breathless, rested her head on his chest for a brief moment. That fleeting, intoxicated surrender represented total immersion into the ideal she craved.
So when she returned, the reality of toasts felt like a slap in the face.
The contrast was absolute. Everything felt cold and dismal. The marriage, now judged against the perfection of Aubusard, was exposed as a sham.
Which leads to that symbolic end of her early marriage with the wedding bouquet.
She finds her dusty, frayed silk wedding bouquet. She throws the orange blossoms into the fire and watches the pieces fly up the chimney like black butterflies. It's a definitive, ritualistic cremation of her first naive illusions. This is Emma recognizing that Charles cannot be the protagonist of her novel, and she has to find a way to rewrite the script herself.
With the marriage fundamentally poisoned and her expectations shattered, a change of scenery was inevitable. The move to Yonville, a smaller, less elegant market town, was meant to be a fresh start, but it only provided new and equally problematic outlets for her.
Yonville is presented as even more provincial than Toasties, a collection of old houses with black beams and half doors to keep the chickens out, lying in the Riel Valley. It was geographically and socially resistant to change.
And it is here we meet Monsieur Homais, the pharmacist, arguably the most important satirical figure in the entire novel.
Oh, absolutely. Homais represents the smug, self-serving, and ultimately successful mediocrity that Emma despises but cannot defeat.
He's the epitome of the pretentious, provincial intellectual who has absorbed all these half-truths and scientific buzzwords without any genuine knowledge.
Right. He claims expertise in everything from agriculture analyzing gases and fertilizers, because he's a chemist, to public policy. He's defined by his intense hatred of the clergy, whom he calls ravens drawn by the smell of corpses, and he's constantly preaching his duty as a citizen and family man.
All while engaging in blatant illegality.
And that illegality is central to his relationship with Charles. The sources reveal Homais' true, opportunistic motive for befriending the new doctor.
He was running an unauthorized medical practice out of his back room, wasn't he?
Exactly. Dispensing advice and compounds, a direct violation of the law that could ruin him. He'd previously been summoned to Rouen and nearly had a stroke, just imagining his pharmacy being auctioned off. So by befriending the naive Charles, Homais essentially bought his silence and complicity.
He leveraged Charles's position for his own protection and self-aggrandizement. It proves that utility trumps decency in Yonville.
It's a perfect illustration of Flaubert's satire. The man who champions science and duty is a criminal whose ambition is purely egoistical.
And while Charles is being trapped by Homais, Emma finds an emotional lifeline in Léon Dupré, the young law clerk.
He's her first intellectual kindred spirit in Yonville.
Léon was sensitive, shy, and he shared Emma's exact dissatisfaction. He loved poets, found verses tender, and explicitly preferred exciting and thrilling novels over the lukewarm feelings of reality.
This common ground, their shared belief that life owed them something better, it bonded them instantly. They connect over shared fantasies, discussing how you find an unformed thought articulated perfectly in a book, feeling like an epiphany of one's deepest self. Their relationship is entirely built on literature and shared dissatisfaction.
It's another version of Bovarism, only this time it's shared.
Right. And we should briefly mention the other defining characters who represent the stifling nature of provincial life.
Like the tax collector, Binet.
The taciturn tax collector, Binet, who was supposedly wealthy but was just obsessed with working on his lathe. He is the personification of silent, strange, productive provincial peculiarity. And Madame France, the busy innkeeper of the Golden Lion, perpetually occupied with kitchen chores.
These are the fixed, inescapable points of the mediocre reality Emma wants to escape.
And we also have to address the massive disappointment that greeted Emma in her domestic life shortly after the move, the birth of her child.
The birth of birth was a source of profound apathy and frustration for Emma, driven again by vanity and financial constraint.
Yes. The initial disappointment was that the child was a girl, but the deeper frustration was financial. She was angry she couldn't afford the pink silk curtains and embroidered bonnets she had wanted for a suitably extravagant nursery.
And because the preparation wasn't up to her aesthetic standards, she just outsourced the entire layette.
Her initial motherly affections were completely lacking. She often showed the child off only to visitors to boast about its sturdy legs, treating her daughter more like an accessory than a beloved family member. Emma's capacity for passion is entirely selfish and aesthetic.
The narrative takes a crucial and devastating turn with the Hippolyte operation, a pivotal moment where both Charles's incompetence and Emma's destructive vanity merge to create a public disaster.
And this directly paves the way for her extramarital affairs.
This event was instigated entirely by Homais, driven by his own desire for fame and recognition. He convinces Charles to perform a novel surgery, a tenotomy on Hippolyte, the limping inn servant, after reading about a new method for correcting club feet.
And Emma was fiercely supportive. She saw this as the key to unlocking Charles's reputation and, by extension, elevating her own social standing. She desperately needed the name Bovary to have significance in medical literature in the newspapers throughout France.
But Charles, whose anatomical knowledge was described explicitly as defective, hesitated. He rightly feared injuring a vital part.
Right. Hippolyte suffered from pes equinus with a slight varus, basically a deformity where the foot is permanently pointed down and slightly inverted. The procedure required cutting the Achilles tendon and anterior tibial muscle. Instead of consulting an expert, Charles just dared to make the cut.
And immediately, Homais, the self-promoter, publishes a sensationalized, flattering report in the Rouen Lighthouse newspaper,
Ensuring that the Bovary name would indeed gain notoriety, just not the positive kind.
The outcome was swift and just, an inevitable failure.
Hippolyte complained of intense pain immediately, but they ignored him. They applied this crude wooden housing, but the foot swelled dramatically, turning blood-stained and gangrenous. It became so bad they had to call in the renowned, experienced Dr. Canavet.
Canavet's arrival meant immediate condemnation. This is Flaubert's critique of provincial malpractice versus genuine competence.
Canavet was furious. He mocked Charles as an ass who was meddling with dangerous surgical fads coming from Paris. He blamed the whole debacle on modern trends like squint operations and chloroform anesthesia.
And the verdict was undeniable. The foot had to be amputated.
Canavet performed the procedure, saving Hippolyte's life, but destroying Charles's reputation.
And the psychological fallout for Emma was massive.
Her humiliation was complete and visceral. This failure cemented her perception of Charles as a wretched, contemptible nullity, a man who couldn't even manage a simple, self-aggrandizing surgery. She concluded that Charles was truly the lock on the door of her agonizing cage. She felt such shame and rage she wished she could physically assault him.
The Hippolyte failure was the catalyst. It fully justified her belief that she was entitled to seek fulfillment elsewhere.
Humiliation drove Emma straight into the arms of the ideal she felt she was entitled to. Having realized Charles was incapable of providing the drama her soul required, she sought the grand passion demanded by her novels. And she found it in Rodolphe Boulanger.
Rodolphe is the antithesis of Charles. He's 34, wealthy, clever, but fundamentally cynical and crude. The classic seasoned womanizer.
He assesses Emma with this cold, professional detachment. He sees a bored, adorable victim who longs for balls in the big city, concluding she was a poor little wife who would snap for love like a carp on a kitchen table for water.
He knew that 3 nice, rehearsed words of flattery would be enough to win her over.
There is zero passion in his initial pursuit. It is calculated conquest. And he engineered the entire courtship meticulously. First, showing up at Charles's office needing a bloodletting, establishing himself socially, and then convincing Charles that Emma needed horseback riding to cure her nerves.
And Charles, of course, was too naive to question any of it.
The pivotal encounter happens in the forest during one of their rides. As they rode through quiet fields of flowering heather and wild violets, he confessed his longing, playing the role of the tormented lover she expected. They dismounted, and in a moment of intoxicated surrender, Emma received his bold confession, feeling a dizzying internal music.
This affair was more than sex for her. It was validation.
Precisely. This experience fundamentally transformed her. She felt she was now a woman, reveling in the certainty that she had finally entered the wonder world of passion and ecstasy.
She grew bolder, started displaying this brazen behavior, like walking with Rodolphe and smoking a cigarette in public to annoy the Philistines.
And this new, assertive, scandalous behavior horrified the townspeople, including Charles's judgmental mother, who quickly reported it to her son. Though Charles, ever passive, refused to believe it.
This consuming fantasy eventually culminated in these detailed, reckless plans for their grand escape.
Emma planned everything with astonishing coldness and practicality regarding the logistics, but zero emotional consideration. Their destination was Italy, Genoa, Marseille.
And in a shocking detail, she involved the insidious merchant Leroux to handle her luggage.
Which connects her romantic affairs directly to her ultimate financial ruin. The very man who would destroy her financially was integrated into her fantasy of escape. It just demonstrates her complete lack of moral boundaries when pursuing her idealized life.
But Rodolphe, ever the cynical realist, had reached his saturation point.
He felt the eternal monotony of sensual passion setting in. When faced with the logistical and financial reality of running away, he retreated. He penned a cruel breakup letter, sealed with candle wax tears to simulate deep suffering.
He justified his cowardice by blaming fate.
Right, claiming he was protecting her precious, visionary nature from the harsh judgment of the world. He played the part of the tragic hero forced to abandon his love for her own good.
And the result for her was total psychological devastation, which manifested physically.
The betrayal triggered immediate convulsions. Emma attempted suicide by asking Charles repeatedly, "The letter. The letter." She suffered a cerebral inflammation and spent 6 weeks at death's door, sinking into prolonged depression. This period of illness highlights how her delusions were literally incompatible with life. When the fantasy dies, Emma nearly dies with it. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoyed this podcast.
Rodolphe's betrayal marked the definitive shift from romantic delusion to true despair, leading to her final spiral, driven by unchecked debt and the increasing coldness of her next affair with Léon.
And we must dedicate significant time to Leroux, the true financial architect of her ruin. He had been quietly establishing the pattern since the early days in Toast, drawing Charles into promissory notes to finance Emma's early purchases.
He's a financial predator operating under this honey-sweet veneer. How exactly did he trap them?
Leroux worked slowly, methodically. He sold Emma luxury items, fine shawls, exotic wood trinkets, silks, all on credit. When the first notes came due, she couldn't pay, so he'd offer to help by drawing up renewal notes, adding exorbitant interest and fees.
Often secured against Charles's property through mortgages that Charles, trusting and ignorant, just signed.
Exactly. With his honey-sweet voice, Leroux meticulously trapped them, ensuring the debt multiplied with every renewal. By the time Emma was desperate, she was signing crippling notes, like one for 4,000 francs, just to cover interest and fees that had accrued. This is the cost of delusion. Her lack of practical financial knowledge compounded her character flaws into irreversible disaster.
And while this debt spiral tightened, she resumed her relationship with Léon, who was now a clerk in Rouen. But this passion was more mechanical, not revolutionary.
The relationship with Léon was less about shared ideals and more about Emma desperately trying to recreate the drama that Rodolphe had provided. Léon was her intellectual equal, but she immediately began molding him.
Right, she demanded he abandon his duties for their weekly Thursday meetings in Rouen. She molded his appearance, demanding he wear black and adopt a stylish tie.
Forcing him to become a carbon copy of the elegant, refined lover she believed she deserved. Her fantasy was clearly more important than Léon's actual identity.
And the infamous Droschride exemplifies this secretive, frantic, and ultimately meaningless passion.
It's one of the most famous scenes in literature for a reason. They spent hours, anonymously, in a carriage with the curtains drawn, circling Rouen relentlessly. The local citizens were astonished by this sealed carriage, which popped up everywhere, locked like a tomb.
It's a perpetual motion machine of secrecy that signified passion without permanence, commitment, or direction.
And it consumed Léon's time and her fractured finances. The detail of Emma's bare hand reaching out under the yellow curtain to scatter paper scraps, a bill, a letter, who knows, that fluttered away like white butterflies, is profoundly symbolic of her just throwing away her life and her funds on fleeting moments.
And Leroux, sensing the affair and the financial recklessness, pushed the final foreclosure.
Yep, Leroux pushed the final payment, forcing Emma into a desperate, frantic search for money. She traveled to Rouen, begging every banker she knew for a loan. They all refused, or politely laughed at her lack of collateral.
So she desperately pleaded with Léon,
Who, though he loved her, lacked the moral courage or the means to steal the large sum of money she required from his firm.
which led to her ultimate soul-crushing humiliation. Not the refusal of money, but the betrayal of trust.
She went to the notary, Guillemot, hoping he would help. He immediately saw her desperation as an opportunity and propositioned her, throwing himself on his knees despite wearing his dressing gown.
And Emma, enraged and heartbroken, recoiled in a final, fiery act of pride, shouting, "You are exploiting my misfortune. This is shameless. I am pitiable, but not purchasable."
She fled, But the shame of that encounter, the realization that her beauty and her desperation made her an object of base commerce, it sealed her fate. It was the final straw, proving that reality was far uglier and more mercenary than her novels had ever depicted.
With financial ruin assured, her lovers either faithless or useless, and her social standing destroyed, this brings us to the climactic end, Emma's final desperate act.
In her last hours of possibility, she made one final doomed pilgrimage, a plea to Rodolphe. She found him at his estate and begged him for the 3,000 francs she needed, clinging to him like a desperate cat and showering him with passionate words.
Words she truly believed would move him, and his refusal was delivered with this chilling, casual cruelty, demonstrating that he saw her purely as an expense, never an equal.
Rodolphe was calm, slightly annoyed, and methodically refused her. Worse, as concrete proof of his own financial priorities, he pointed out the expensive trinkets he still owned, the silver-mounted rifles, the tortoiseshell inlaid clock items she had previously admired,
He told her flatly he did not have the money.
proving that his self-interest was superior to her entire existence. The ideal she had created in Rodolphe shattered, leaving only the cynical brute.
So with the failure of romance and the failure of finance confirmed, she chose death.
She fled straight back to Yonville and sought out Homais' pharmacy, which he pompously called his Capernaum, his sanctuary. The irony here is profound.
She finds the tools for her ultimate romantic escape in the domain of the scientific charlatan she despises.
She slipped into his inner sanctum and ingested a large dose of arsenic, the white powder, while the pharmacist was loudly berating his apprentice, Justin, for using a medicinal apparatus improperly. The final moments are agonizing.
Charles was utterly lost, completely confused by the sudden convulsions. When she finally confessed, he threw himself into the arms of Dr. Canivet, who arrived too late. But Flaubert grants her one final symbolic moment of authority.
Yes, the ultimate authority appeared. Dr. Larivière, an ancient, highly respected Parisian surgeon. Larivière is Flaubert's representation of true, incorruptible professional competence, a man immune to provincial foolishness.
He took one look and knew.
He examined her corpse-like face, listened to Canivet's confused report, shook his head, and immediately declared her beyond hope. He even refused Homais' desperate invitation for breakfast, showing his contempt for the entire provincial affair. He represented the world Emma desired, but a world too cold and rational to save her.
With the medical world defeated, the priest stepped in to administer the last rites.
And this ritual is profoundly symbolic and horrifying. Bournisien administered the rites, anointing her eyes, which craved earthly splendor, her nostrils, which inhaled the languid breezes and perfumes of love, her mouth, which had spoken so many lies, her hands, which rejoiced in pleasure, and finally the soles of her feet, which had carried her so quickly to fulfill her desires.
Every part of her body that had sinned by craving earthly pleasure was consecrated.
And in her final moments, Flaubert provides one last, hideous juxtaposition.
The blind beggar.
Yes. Her very last sensory experience was one of utter disgust. The blind beggar, whom Homais had so often denounced as a vagabond, stood outside the window and sang a high-pitched, hideous song, a grotesque symbol of the ugly, inescapable reality of human misery. This song mixed with the paroxysms of her failing nerves, forcing her to smile one last time, a horrible, convulsive grin, before she looked in the mirror, her eyes beginning to roll and sink into pale slime, and she died, still trapped between the beautiful vision and the ugly reality.
That brings us to the aftermath, which is perhaps the cruelest commentary Flaubert delivers, detailing the fate of the survivors.
Charles was just utterly devastated, embodying tragic, blind devotion to the end. In a final, desperate act, he approached her body, pulled back the curtains, and blindly, haphazardly cut off a lock of her beautiful black hair, leaving several bald spots on her scalp.
It's an image of grotesque mutilation replacing beauty, demonstrating the extent of his unseeing love and his passive, fumbling nature.
His end was equally pitiful. He died later, completely ruined, still devoted to her memory, clinging to her trinkets. He kept her boots and hat, unable to move on, financially and emotionally destroyed by the woman he loved but never understood.
And Leon.
Leon, the law clerk, moved on with bureaucratic efficiency, marrying a more sensible woman named Leo Katie Leboeuf. It just demonstrates that his romantic leanings were merely youthful affectations.
But the truly devastating concluding irony, the one that drives the satire home, belongs to the figure of Homais.
The pharmacist. The man who orchestrated the disastrous clubfoot surgery, provided the poison that killed Emma, and generally contributed to the Bovary's ruin through his vanity. he continued to flourish.
He wrote a lengthy, self-serving, and sensationalized article about her death while tending his geraniums to maintain his respectable facade.
He didn't just survive, he conquered.
Right. He relentlessly campaigned for official recognition, selling himself to the local government, writing flattering, obsequious letters, and eventually achieving complete respectability and success in Yonville, constantly pursuing the coveted Legion of Honor.
And the source material is very clear. Homé's moral and professional ascent, his greasy, self-serving mediocrity, contrasts sharply with the physical and moral destruction of Emma and Charles. The mediocre, self-serving realist wins, while passion and aspiration destroy themselves.
It's Flaubert's final, biting comment on the nature of 19th century society.
It creates a perfectly calibrated satirical commentary. Emma dies because she pursues the sublime. Charles dies because he is too dull to live. And Homé thrives because he is smart enough to leverage both science and hypocrisy for personal gain.
So let's wrap this incredible, dense dive with the central takeaways for you, the listener, distilled directly from our sources.
First, the core tragedy of Bovarism. This chronic, destructive dissatisfaction that results from reading literature as a prescriptive blueprint for life. Emma tried to inhabit a novel, and reality shredded her. The inability to distinguish fantasy from fact is fatal.
Second, the satire of vanity and mediocrity. The narrative demonstrates how moral rot represented by Homé's self-promotion and Leroux's financial predation can succeed professionally, while genuine, intense, if misguided, emotion only leads to ruin.
Success is often granted to the competent hypocrite. And finally, the cost of delusion. The story shows how a simple lack of practical knowledge, Charles's anatomical deficiency, Emma's complete ignorance of finance compounds, tragic character flaws into irreversible disaster. Passion is no defense against a promissory note.
This entire story, this profound tragedy, leaves us with one final provocative thought to consider.
Emma Bovary's intense emotional life, her capacity for deep, consuming feeling, however misplaced, was ultimately no match for the simple, ugly machinery of provincial society and financial debt. Flaubert stripped away all spiritual redemption from her death. This raises an important question for all of us. When you refuse to compromise your romantic ideals, when you choose the sublime over the sensible, are you committing a brave, passionate act of self-affirmation? Or are you merely guaranteeing your own disaster? We leave that with you.